At first glance, it may seem as if A is the opening statement with the introductory tone in the nation's most populous state, home to one of the world's largest economies, and further. But once we read the rest of the statements, we realize that is not the case. We see that all of the statements have parts in quotations, some of them entirely, some of them mostly, most of it. We see the introduction to this idea in C, which says reports the Washington Post. And then we find that all of these statements, as in B, C, and D, they talk about factors of a deficit, or rather the impact of a deficit. If you look at these statements, they are very similar. B tells us as many as 30,000 government workers who had been expecting pay raises in the fall are instead receiving formal notices warning that they could lose their jobs by then because the state is broke. C tells us any day now, community colleges here may begin telling faculty members that they cannot be paid and students that summer classes are cancelled. And D says nursing homes are losing so much state aid that many soon may have to shut down or limit their services, a prospect that has elderly residents confused and frightened. Then we have A, which says this is life in California. So now we realize that the part in quotations is a very important aspect, and the word this here connects to these aspects, which talks about life in California, and California being on the brink of a financial disaster. The nation's most populous state, home of one of the world's largest economies, has been staring in disbelief at the same dire predicament for months. A $38 billion deficit, the largest shortfall in its history and an extreme example of the budget woes afflicting many states. So the first thing that we realize is this would come in later after these sentences, which means that by the looks of it, A is actually the last statement. Of these three statements, B, C, and D, it is statement C that is the first statement because it introduces the premise of the Washington Post reporting these aspects. Thus we connect the quotations. These are quotations because these are statements made in articles published by the Washington Post in their news. And these articles or these statements from their articles, they give us the impact of the different examples of the impact of the deficit which is hinted at in B, C, and D, which is then finally directly referenced in statement A. So because this gives us the subject, the speaker of these lines or the writer of these lines, C comes first in the sequence. So let's put C in as the opening statement. Next up, we get B and D. We have already seen the references. B and D are very close to each other. Both of them are talking about two different impacts. In B, we have government workers being adversely affected by the deficit. And in D, we have nursing homes being adversely affected, losing aid, and thus facing the prospect of having to shut down or limit their services. And also elderly residents being confused and frightened because of that. So what if nursing homes, they shut down? Then what about these people who have to depend on those nursing homes for their care and well-being, for their health? They would have to look for other sources, other avenues, other nursing homes even. So it could be BD or DB. We are not very certain of that. So we mark it as such. We have BD or DB. Once that is done, we realize that B actually connects with A, because B ends by stating, because the state is broke. This introduces the state. And then this immediately connects with A, which says this is life in California, the nation's most populous state, directly referring to the state, naming the state as California. And talking about the deficit, a $38 billion deficit, the largest shortfall in its history and an extreme example of the budget woes afflicting many states. So we find that B and A form a connection. If we do take the order as BD, then we'll introduce the state in B, and then we'll go to another factor of the deficit, nursing homes, etc., elderly residents confused and frightened. Then we don't have as such a very direct connection between this and A. There is a connection because these statements are all related, but we have a much stronger connection between, because the state is broke in B and this is life in California in A. This also connects with the mention of the most populous state in A. So we realize that B and A are connected statements, so they should be consecutive statements, which means that the correct choice here between these two would be DB. And that means that D comes into the sequence as the second statement, B comes in as the third statement, and finally we have A as the concluding statement. So with this, we have the sequence ready. We have our sequence, final sequence done. The correct answer is CDBA.